to face the white's king's pawn move pawn to e4. In response to this, black goes pawn to c6, and on the next move, typically they follow up with pawn to d5. And whether you play e4 as white on the first move, or whether you play the Caro-Kann defense as black, my goal is to give you a complete understanding, complete overview of the opening move by move, so that you know how to handle it. And you don't have to memorize a ton of variations, you just know what are the right moves, what are the right plans, ideas, and of course we'll spice it up with some juicy tricks. Alright, let's start from the very beginning. So the very first question is, why to even play c6 for black? Why not to push the pawn 2 squares forward? Is it that black was unaware that they could play 2 squares forward on the first move? Actually, there was a funny case where Mikhail Tal trolled Jan Fischer with this stuff. He initially pretended to play pawn c6, known as a more defensive opening, but then said, no, I'm going all out and push the pawn all the way forward to c5. The main advantage of the Caro-Kann defense is that it is solid and simple. As you go pawn to c6 followed by pawn to d5, you kind of lock the position in the center of the board. You also don't allow any kind of bishop c4 moves, which are often annoying in traditional openings, and therefore you secure your position from any kind of early attacks. Let's compare that to the usual e4, pawn e5 instead. Here, first of all, like at any point, white can go for this bishop c4, targeting your weakest square f7, and that often starts various kinds of fried liver, scholars checkmating, attacking ideas. On top of that, if you play e5 on the first move, you gotta be ready to face a bunch of openings, such as the knight f3, or the King's Gambit, or all kinds of d4 moves at any point, knight c3, the Vienna game, the bishop's opening. So there are a ton of openings here, and many of them are theoretically heavy and aggressive for white. For that reason, many coaches recommend for black to play pawn to c6 or pawn to e6, which are simpler because you narrow it down to just a single opening, plus again your position is really solid, you basically don't risk any early attacks from white. That solid nature of an opening comes at the price of a little bit passive position where you're lacking space a little bit, which is especially clear if white chooses to play the advanced variation, where this pawn takes away the natural f6 square from your knight, and this pawn from c6 does not allow you to bring the other knight normally, and so you see that you have a little bit of a clumsy situation. I mean, that's not a big issue. If you know how to deal with this, which we're going to talk about in a moment, you'll see that that's not a big issue. Anyway, main pros of the opening is that it's simple and solid, and main disadvantage is that it's a little bit passive. But the good thing is that your opponents cannot attack you, and they often don't know what to do, so they play bad moves and they lose. Now let's talk about the main lines more specifically. At the moment, you're attacking this pawn on e4, and therefore white needs to deal with this somehow. There are three usual ways for white to handle that. They can first of all just choose the simplest option and take on d5. Alternatively, they can push the pawn forward, choosing the advanced variation. And finally, they can defend this pawn by going knight to c3, and from there it guards the pawn this way. So these are the three main variations that black needs to be ready to face if they're choosing to play the Caro-Kann defense. Players who are not very well familiar with this, the beginner level players, they often choose to play the simplest option, which is an exchange on d5, and simultaneously it is also the weakest option of white, because after that, notice that your pawn from c6 relocates to a much better central square, thus vacating the c6 square for your knight, and therefore you basically have no problems whatsoever. Just compare this position with the advanced variation which we saw previously. If instead of an exchange, white pushes the pawn forward. Now notice that this pawn is an asset, it takes away this square from your knight, and the c6 pawn of black is more of an obstacle in the way of the other knight. So here white claims to have some space advantage and tries to put pressure on black, versus if we simply take away these two pawns from the board, then we are getting the exchange variation, right? So that is clearly in the favor of black. So that's why those amateur players who just choose to simply trade on c6, they think that they found a smart way to not learn the opening, but in fact they give you a very good and comfortable game. So after that you just develop casually. In most cases they play simple development moves. You then can bring your bishop out to g4, which is a very common motif in lots of the variations of the Caro-Kann defense. Basically, at this point, you want to develop your dark square bishop at some point. But if you push the pawn forward, given the diagonal for the bishop, that simultaneously locks the other bishop behind this pawn chain. And we do not want that. We want our bishop to be more active. That's why before pushing your e6 pawn forward, you first bring the bishop out, and only then on the next move you then solidify your pawn chain in the center of the board, and now you are good to go. So let's say at castles, I mean, you don't even have to know any open in theory here, really. You just develop your pieces in naturally, and on the next move you castle, you're good to go. You've got the semi-open file for your rook, you can place it there. Your knight has a nice square e4, you can always land it there, starting to be more active, and overall you're having a great game here. This is clearly not dangerous for black. Moving on to the next main line is the advanced variation pawn to e5, which we have discussed a little bit already. And by the way, a little later I'll tell you what is my main weapon for handling Caro-Kann as white. And this is really deadly opening, especially in blitz. But for now, let's just cover the main stuff. So pawn e5, the advanced variation. Now, black has to decide how to untangle their minor pieces because it's not obvious how to develop them. There are two main lines here for black. It's either to play bishop f5, developing a bishop, again, the standard idea, first to bring the bishop out and then lock the pawn chain in the center, or to play c5, trying to challenge white center and give more space for your pieces so that you can later on develop your knight normally. So these are the two main lines. The most traditional line is bishop f5, followed by pawn e6, that idea where you build basically the London system as black, right, or the Slav defense as black. And although that is the main line, but I actually recommend that you go for the c5 line, just because on amateur level it works better. Also, if you play bishop f5, there are a ton of variations that you gotta need to learn, including like the most aggressive pawn to g4, or a tricky pawn to h4, where initially this move doesn't seem to make much sense, and a lot of players, including strong players, play the planned move pawn e6, which actually loses on the spot with pawn to g4, and all of a sudden it turns out that the bishop is actually trapped here, and whenever it go somewhere where I can always keep attacking it until the bishop is completely captured and it's time for black to resign. While there is nothing wrong with going into the main line with bishop to f5, I recommend that you go for the central advancement pawn to c5 here. At first, this move looks weird because you have just played c6 previously and now you push the pawn forward to c5 in two moves instead of doing it in one go, but because both sides are playing checkers so far, none of them touch their pieces, that's alright, you don't fall behind in development. Now, here is the main advantage of the move pawn to c5. On amateur level, the most common move by white here is trying to maintain their pawn chain by playing pawn to c3, which is wrong. Now, spoiler, pros play here pawn takes c5, but that's more advanced level stuff, so most of your opponents will stick to this move pawn to c3, kind of playing by analogy with the French defense, but the situation is different. Here in this position, unlike the French defense, if you just keep developing pieces, your bishop is not locked there, because your pawn is not on e6 yet, and therefore you can first bring the bishop out to this active square, and only then lock the center, and now you have a much better version of the French defense, where the main problem, this light squared bishop, is now actually an asset, it puts pressure. Moreover, quite often your opponents do not understand really the weakness of their position, which is the weakness of this pawn chain, and they play h3 at some point, which is wrong. And we'll see why in a moment. The thing is, in this case, you actually are okay with trading this bishop for a knight, because after that, you can start to attack the base point of his pawn chain, and white just can't really defend it. Queen b6 is a common move. Now you attack this pawn twice, and white already are defenseless, actually, because, you know, besides attacking this pawn, your queen also targets this pawn on b2, therefore making it harder for white to use the dark square bishop. Moreover, if you want to put even more pressure onto this pawn, there is also a very classical maneuver here. You develop your knight through e7 to f5, and it's an excellent square where it adds one more attack to this pawn. And basically, quite often your opponents see that they cannot defend this pawn on d4, so they just castle. Now you can grab the pawn on d4, so you're already a pawn up, your pieces are active. This pawn on e5 is also weak, white has no attack and no idea of what to do, and you already have achieved a winning game. And now we're approaching the main line, knight to c3. For many years, it's been considered the main weapon of white, and up to this date, a lot of pros use this move, and of course, amateurs use it as well. White defends the pawn on e4, and also puts more pressure to black's center. In this position, black takes on e4 typically because they've got nothing else to do, really. If you think about the position, you cannot develop your bishop at this point, because this square is taken away by the queen, this square is taken away by the pawn, and this square is just terribly passive, so you cannot really move the bishop. And if you try to develop a knight this way, white can push forward and chase it back, therefore that doesn't work either, and so black has no other option but to take on e4, because you need a little bit of space to move around. Now, after white recaptures, you still can see the main drawback of the Caro-Kann defense. You're lacking space a little bit, so technically speaking, black is occupying the last 3 ranks, and white is kind of occupying 4 ranks, right? Starting from here and then going all the way back to the first rank, right? So white is having more space and more freedom of maneuver. Now, there are different ways for black to go about this. I recommend the move knight f6. Even though you're willing to double your pawns after this exchange, there are certain other advantages. For example, if you want to avoid doubling pawns and play knight to d7, preparing this move knight f6 so that this square is supported by the other knight, white can play a tricky move queen e2. And now if black follows along with their plan knight f6, that actually leads to a nice cozy checkmate with knight to d6 due to the fact that the pawn is pinned. That just goes to illustrate that you have some space problems that you ideally would wish to handle somehow. That's why I recommend knight f6 here, going for the so-called Tartakower variation. You attack this knight, and if white doesn't want to move back and waste time, they take on f6, which is what they usually do. You then recapture with a pawn. And now you opened up the position completely. Now you have no problems developing your pieces whatsoever. Therefore, you solve the main problem of the Caro-Kann defense, the lack of space. Also, when you play the Caro-Kann defense, typically you want a simple game, so you don't have to memorize a ton of stuff. And that's exactly what you get here. After that, you will just develop pieces naturally without really the need to know anything. That's cool. Now, yeah, you have these doubled pawns on the king side, so theoretically, if you're facing Magnus Carlsen or somebody else, they will drive you into an endgame and use their pawn majority in the center of the board, create a passed pawn, promote it into a queen and win, but since we don't face those monsters, we don't have to worry about that. Your opponents will typically try to attack your king, and now you overprotected your king side, and you're gonna castle there, right? So now we've got this kind of top floor for your castle, the main residence of your king, which is cool, right? You can probably have some great view from there or something else, I don't know. Anyway, you overprotected your king, which is nice, because now your opponent will have no clue of what to do. Now you threaten rook e8 check, so let's say they castle, now you can bring your bishop out to g4, again, very simple, you just develop your pieces, they play something, you then develop your knight, then they also play something, doesn't really matter, and you have finished your development. Life is good, no need to worry about anything, no need to know the theory. Now, what are you going to do next? Now, let me just share with you a couple common middle game ideas planned so that you know which ideas to pick from. I mean, definitely you want to bring your rook to e8. That's the only open file in the position, and your rook will be active there. So that's the move that you'll pretty much always play here. All right, after that, I will do something. Again, what the beauty of the Caro-Kann defense is that your opponents cannot really attack your king. And because they're not super advanced level players, they don't know what to do otherwise. And so they just start to shuffle around, play bad moves, and often lose. Or they try to go for some desperate attack anyway, which fails, and they still lose. In this position, I think the most played move is something like h3, attacking your bishop. Doesn't do much, you can just drop it back. Then they still feel annoyed by this pin. Their queen can't move away, because then you can take on f3 and destroy their pawn structure. So they play something like bishop e2. Now, what do you do next? Again, a couple common maneuvers. Quite often in the Caro-Kann defense, you can break open with c5 at some point, so that you eliminate white's most advanced pawn and your position becomes free. But you don't have to hurry with that, you can do that anytime you want. What else can you do? You can just play queen c7, simply to finalize your development, connecting your rooks so that both of them are ready to take part in the game. You're creating this battery along this diagonal. Again, just a normal solid move. What else can you play? Another common maneuver is to relocate this knight to a better square. You can do this either through some f8 e6 maneuver, maybe targeting f4 square, so let me draw those lines, something like this, or you can go this way, knight b6, aiming for this d5 juicy square. That's a pretty cool maneuver, by the way. So let's say white does something, knight e2, you trade. Now you could play knight d5, perfectly fine move, but there is another thing as well. Your f6 pawn initially just overprotects your king. But if there is no danger, such as in this position, you can actually use this pawn for a more aggressive role, and you can just push it forward. And now you're ready to push forward and actually grab this bishop on f4. So that's another interesting idea for black in this game. I mean, I'll show you an example line. Of course, you don't have to memorize it. I'm just showing you different common plans that black can use so that you have an idea of what to do in the middle game. Okay, of course, it's not for memorizing, really. Now, if white, let's say, is annoyed by these threats, they can play queen f3, trying to put pressure. You can defend and renew the threat of pawn to f4. Knight e5 is still coming. If they go bishop f4 themselves to block your pawn, you can trade. Now you can also use the rook along the e-file. You can use your knight. So you see that life's pretty good. For example, you can go inside with rook to e2. And usually as you penetrate there, that creates a ton of problems for white. For example, if they just try to trade it off, then they already lose on the spot because you can go knight d5, attack this queen to counterblow, and as the queen goes away to any square, and otherwise you just capture it, you're gonna pick up this knight on d2 and continue your devastation there. So that's how white was just shuffling around, was not really sure what to do, and you gradually outplays them. And that's quite a common scenario when you're playing Caro-Kann against an aggressive player who knows nothing but to attack your king, which doesn't work. And before I show you my main way to handle Caro-Kann as white, let's have a quick warm-up for you. It's a tactical warm-up. Actually, this position took place in the game of the author of the opening, Kann himself. He's playing black, it is black to play and win. And here he played a move which won the game. Now, if you can find it, please write it down in the comments below. And here comes the real Igor Nation stuff. What to do if someone challenges you with the Caro-Kann defense. So you're playing e4, and your opponent goes pawn to c6. What do you do here? Do you run and hide? No. We play pawn d4, pawn d5, knight c3. We pretend to just play the main line, but after he trades on e4, you don't play the move which everyone else plays. But instead, you play in a gambit style. You offer one more pawn by going pawn to f3. This time you want to recapture by pawn, building this beautiful pawn center. Therefore, in most cases, they capture here, and now we recapture with a knight. And by playing this gambit, you actually get to the point where your opponent feels extremely annoyed. First of all, you drag him into unfamiliar territory. Most likely he knows nothing about this opening. Secondly, you get a very strong attacking position. Your bishop is ready to come out to c4, targeting this square. You can castle kingside, and after that, your rook will stand on the f-file, adding more pressure here. Your other pieces are also ready to be developed quickly. Bishop g5, putting pressure there. So you're ready to put together this quick attack against him, against his king, and that is what black tried to avoid by playing the Caro-Kann defense in the first place. That is why it's so annoying for black. Also, there is a common tactical trick here. Quite often in these positions, they play by analogy with main lines. They go bishop g4, trying to develop the bishop and then lock the position in the center. But in this case, it fails because you've got this tactical shot, bishop takes f7, and after that you follow up with knight to e5, which is a fork to the king and the bishop. Therefore, you grab the bishop on the next move and just get basically a winning position because you already